great to see y'all. My job this afternoon is to mostly stay out of the way of these smart people, and I'll try to do that, but I've got to tell you some things before we really get started, and maybe offer a little bit of shaping language. So this is Divining the Deep South, a three-genre conversation, a purposeful conversation across difference and approach. And it's appropriate that the Center for the Study of Southern Culture is one of the underwriters of this program, because that's where I learned to think about the South, and one other person on this panel learned there too. That academic approach, like our conversation today, what the center does, depends on an interdisciplinary approach to the South. So a semester in graduate school at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture might include, like a history class that connects the paintings of Thornton Dial, a retired steel worker from Alabama, to the expressive power the civil rights movement unleashed. A class in political science might chart the impact of Nixon's Southern strategy on the political climate of today. So you might think about our panel today, Dividing the Deep South, as the shortest grad school class ever. 50 minutes of smart conversation without the tuition or the hassle of trying to find a parking place on campus. That's funnier for people who are at the University of Mississippi right now, where parking is a bear. And I'll extend the metaphor just a little bit, because just like in college, it's important to buy the books. So these books, representing these authors, will be for sale in the tent after. And authors love to come to book festivals because you talk to other authors, and that's fun. They also love it when you buy their books. So on behalf of my friends and colleagues, I urge you, buy their books, get them to sign. They'll be in the signing tent right after this. So each of these authors travel the Deep South in their own way, with questions in their head about our shared past, this challenging present, and our collective future. These authors come from different places, different disciplines. Their work originates from different perspectives. Each offers us new ways to think about the Deep South, ways to reframe, reorder, re-understand. So now I'm going to read short bios of those three, so you know who's up here. Because you heard about me, which is relatively unimportant. You want to hear who these people are. So to my immediate right, Mr. Boyce Upholt, a native of Connecticut, educated at Haverford College. He moved to the Mississippi Delta in 2009 to work for Teach for America. Boyce is published in The Atlantic, in National Geographic, the Virginia Quarterly Review, and The Great River is his first book, and he represents nonfiction. Alongside January Gill O'Neill, representing the great house of poetry, the canon of poetry. Associate professor at Salem State University. She is the author of Glitter Road, which has real live glitter on it, in the part of that gold band running through the Fisk map there on the cover, and 3 previous poetry collections. Her poems and articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine and the journal Poetry. From 2019 to 2020, when I was lucky to get to know January, she served as the John and Renee Grisham Writer-in-Residence at the University of Mississippi. I see many people out there nodding. I thought, yeah, I remember that. She's cool. All right, on the end, speaking of cool kids, Kate Medley, photojournalist for photojournalism documentation. She represents that genre, our third genre. A native of Jackson, Mississippi. Her mom and daddy are right here. That's beautiful. That's great. This is one of the great things about this festival is like people come from around the country to land here in our backyard, and also people come from down the street. That enmeshing of those two worlds is what makes this work. So I'm glad y'all are here. So she earned a master's degree in Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. Kate is a working photojournalist who publishes regularly in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Her first book, it's heavy to pick up. Thank you, please come again, won a 2024 Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Prize. So now you know who's up on stage. Yeah, Now you know our genres. Now you know our people. So, this panel, as I mentioned, is purposefully diverse in terms of representation of genre and subject and the like. So we had a Zoom call, which is what you do to get ready for something like this. And we started talking about how to introduce our work to each other and how to introduce it to you. So we decided instead of Boyce reading Boyce's work, Boyce is going to read you an excerpt from one of his friends, one of his colleagues up here, something he admired in their work as a way to introduce you to the people who are here. I have no idea who would like to go first, but it doesn't really matter. Please jump in. Maybe you, Boyce, since you're right there. There we go.
That's easy.
All right,
so I have the honor and pleasure of introducing you to Kate's work, and she made it very easy because, I should show you the photos. I was like, should I pick a photo? But I feel like I can turn to basically any page. But let me read to you from the introduction where she really beautifully lays out the project here. And so this is after describing the fact that gas stations are kind of waning as a business, right? More and more, it's a convenience store that happens to sell gas, and they sell the gas at a cheap price to get you in the door because that's where they're going to make their money. And so after laying that out, Kate writes, "While gas stations have changed, so have we. Our politics may be polarized, our economics stratified, our neighborhoods segregated, and our rhetoric strained, but still, nearly everyone regularly passes through these same commercial spaces. We fill up the tank. We relieve our bladders. We grab a cold one on the way home from work. We take advantage of Friday night's prime rib special. We may rub elbows as we pass the ketchup. In an increasingly atomized world of mediated interactions, we have fewer and fewer communal spaces that unite us." And so she goes on to say, I found gas station girls featuring emerging immigrant foodways. Others fuel the region's farm workers with hot plate lunches, pre-dawn biscuits for hunters, young chefs getting their career start, easily portable meals for laborers and travelers, basic groceries in towns without a Kroger or a Publix. This is not a book about gas, nor a guidebook. I'm not reviewing these restaurants or making any claim that they represent the best gas station food across the region. It's a book about work, culture, and survival. And so again, I'm literally just going to turn, I was going to share, one of the amazing things here is like several gas stations in here are like meaningful to my life, which is interesting, the way these stories intersect. But like you can, here's one. I believe this may be a gas station near where I now live in New Orleans that I used to walk to get beer at night, right? And so it was incredible to me to see, like these things are just in the background of my life and matter and shape my life. But until a talented documentarian comes along and frames it that way, you don't see these pathways. So.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll go next.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read from Boyce's beautiful book, The Great River. Notice we have a little in common. It's coinkydink, I don't know. So I'm going to read two passages. Hopefully I don't go on too long. So I just really enjoyed Boyce's phrasing and writing, and this section is a little bit more descriptive of the Mississippi. When you sit upon the lower Mississippi's surface in a canoe, you realize this river has its own topography, crests and valleys, feet high, curls and curves and whirls, wide, still boils. The long light at sunset and sunrise reveals a labyrinth of ripples. On some mornings, the water lifts into the mist so thick you realize there is no end to the air and no beginning to the water. So your boat floats upon and within the river at once. Nor does this river have any real bottom. When the engineer and inventor James Buchanan Eads sank himself into the Mississippi near Cairo to salvage lost cargo, his feet never found solid purchase. There was just a rushing current and increasingly dense mud. Eads' rival, Andrew Humphreys, conducted the U.S. Army's first comprehensive study of the river and noted eddies that spanned half its width and surged upstream at 7 miles an hour. Humphreys declared the river a turbid and boiling torrent, immense in volume and force. A few sentences later, he added, rather hopefully, that all this water was governed by laws. And this section, spoke to me because I've had a similar experience. I grew up far from this river amid a sprawl of suburbs in Connecticut, a place where the word Mississippi was just a 4-syllable approximation of the length of 1 second. Convenient for counting time in a game of tag. Even after footloose happenstance delivered me into this walled territory along the river, I took a job in rural Mississippi working in struggling schools that began to eke out a life, as I began to eke out a life as a writer on the side. I paid little attention to the nation's big river. Its waters were irrelevant because they were invisible, hidden behind the wall. Then I took on a magazine assignment to write a profile of a man named John Ruskey. Like me, Ruskey had wandered into Mississippi from far afield, Colorado in his case, lured by the chance to learn blues guitar at the feet of the masters. Eventually, Ruskey took an office job in a small town museum to pay the bills. A child of the mountains, he found the hours trapped behind a desk were rather claustrophobic for relief. So for relief, he went out onto the river, exploring its islands and back channels by canoe. And then he goes on to talk about how John started the Quapaw Canoe Company and how Boyce went out on the river, and that inspired him for the book. And I will just add that that was one of my experiences too, to go out and take a canoe ride down the Mississippi. I'm curious, how many of you have done that? Have you had a chance to go down and do a little bit of that? It's really a wonderful experience.
Hopefully we'll convince more of you to do so before we're done.
Yeah. So it was nice to read about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
January.
Yeah.
Well, I have the great fortune of introducing you, those of you who are not familiar, to January Gill O'Neill's book, Glitter Road, which my 5-year-old has taken to calling the Golden River book.
Oh, I like that.
I like it too.
Yeah.
When I first learned about January's work and saw that she teaches in Massachusetts and has New England roots, I was surprised then later to find that so much of her book stems from the relatively short time that she lived in Mississippi, which was clearly formative in many ways for her work, certainly this work. But I was delighted to find that not only is the poetry beautiful, in many instances it's funny, it's irreverent, it is serious, it's eye-opening, it truly contains multitudes. So I will try to do justice to 2 of January's poems. This one's called Low Delta Country. Driving along Highway 6, I'm not sure where the towns begin and end. Heavy trees lean ground close, choked by kudzu, roots growing over enslaved land, wild daffodils sprouting across long demolished plantations and working farms, plots pocked with mostly unmarked graves. I should have chased that laughter at the gas station and said hello to whoever stood there, but had nowhere to go but inside. Only towns, like only children, carry the loneliness of broken windows in their eyes. They disappear when the buzzards stop their soar over shorn fields, give up midair, and drop like a wine bottle. Goldenrod, deer bones, billboards for now defunct businesses, in the town's one strip mall. Maybe some places should rewild. In the land of John Deere machines, pick clean what the enslaved people did by hand. Irrigation rigs big as pterodactyls sit idle after the harvest. Tufts of cotton fleck the landscape like cheap insulation. Glitter Road. I'll take my miracles however they appear these days. A salamander poking its head above the bricks, the shocking blue overcoat of the season's first bluebird, a spiderweb unbroken. At the corner of Molly Bar and McElroy, I saw a thick trail of glitter in the curve of the right turn lane. Fuchsia, heavy shimmer refracting the noonday sun, as if laying flat a rainbow's extracted hue. Not paint or blood or a parade shedding its cheer. It's the faded streak of eyeshadow as it trails into flecks, then disappears. I think of cars passing through this moment, their undercarriages aglow with possibility. Hard not to feel good riding a glistening wave. My tires now bespeckled with a purple sheen that's tough to rid or wash away. The road ahead made beautiful by this temporary shine. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Right. So now you know who's up here. Now you know their work. So now we're gonna have a conversation, and I have 4 questions. I may not use all 4, and then we're gonna open it up to y'all. So I want y'all to be actively involved in this conversation. You can ask a question of one of these folks, or you can ask a more general question of all 3, however you want to engage, but we definitely want y'all engaged. So I'm going to start with one question that's pretty broad. This idea, and you can tell this from what we just heard, that their work, though different, intersects in a number of different ways, and the strongest tie that binds y'all to the Deep South is your relationship to Mississippi. And I want to think about the relationship, but I want to go deeper and ask, what's your responsibility to Mississippi?
Who wants to go?
We studied hard.
Yeah, okay. So, as John mentioned, I was the Grisham writer in 2019, and I convinced my children, who were teenagers at the time, to come with me. You know, they got a dog out of it. So we came down, and, you know, we didn't know what to expect. And so before we came down, that was about the time, a few months before, that there was this picture that went viral of these 3 students, these Old Miss students, standing next to the Emmett Till marker. And at the time, the college was sort of wrestling also with this, you know, giant statue that was on campus that everybody seemed to want removed, but the campus was taking their time removing it. And so, you know, coming from Massachusetts, I wasn't sure what to expect. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised. It gave me having the time down there gave me the chance to get a better understanding of Mississippi as a whole. And my book is about, you know, examining my connection to Emmett Till and looking at my relationship with the slavery and Mississippi's history and how that has affected me. And I'm from Virginia, so I understand the South. But here it's different. But as far as responsibility goes, I mean, I feel as if I am, you know, representing Mississippi in a different way. Like, I really want to honor what I've discovered and learned, and the friendships I've made, and the people who are here, and how much Mississippi has changed my life. You know, just like any place, though, you want to be honest about what's happening, but, you know, you also want to find some grace to go along with that. So when people ask, what's it like to be in Mississippi? You know, I want to be able to be truthful about it and not play into stereotypes about what people think the South is. Mm-hmm. And so I feel very strongly about that. And I also, you know, talk quite a bit about joy. I mean, there's a lot of trauma, you know, that's associated with the land and its history, but this really is a joyful place. I mean, you know, not playing to the crowd or anything, but like, this is one of the many joyful experiences I have in Mississippi. It's one of the things that keeps me coming back. So there you go. Yeah. Stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for going first.
Yeah.
Give us something to work off of.
I'll go next. So I grew up in Jackson, and I left the South when I was 18 and moved to the Rocky Mountain West. I went to college in Montana and studied photojournalism there. And in retrospect, I learned a lot from my friends in college and the way that they talked about Mississippi and the South. And I'm sure many of you have, I see you nodding, I'm sure many of you have experienced leaving here and sort of re-experiencing where you come from through the eyes of someone else in another part of this country. And it's eye-opening. It certainly was for me as an 18-year-old. I would see reflected back at me the Mississippi where people are all uneducated and all conservative and all either white or black and all eating the same things and thinking the same ideas. And this just stood in such stark contrast to the experience that I had growing up here in Jackson. And in retrospect, that became the basis for much of the work that I do now. I work as a photojournalist, and I feel driven to sort of complicate that narrative and disrupt this idea of sort of a monolithic South. And so yeah, I think to answer your question, John T., that I feel a great responsibility to Mississippi, despite the fact that I no longer live here. I return often and find it just the richest place to tell story. So yes.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm going to repeat a lot here, but I kind of stumbled into Mississippi as a 25-year-old, didn't know anything about the Mississippi Delta where I decided to live, and it really is home now. I lived in the Delta for 9 years. I've been in New Orleans for 6. But I think being here this weekend has been such a reminder of I think I became a writer because of Mississippi. It is such a literary place. It was always my dream, and then being here is just well, I can't not try. And just everything all day today, I've been oh yeah, this is just like people who don't know me, but they know me because they're Oxford people and we know people in common. There's just this community that I don't think I would have made it as a New York writer. I would have been crushed there, and I could make it here. But I think that, in terms of responsibility, I think as someone who then moves through worlds, right, as I go back, my mom still lives in Hartford, Connecticut. I go there and we'll be at like a dinner party and some very liberal friend of hers will be like, I could never live down there. And so the responsibility, I think, is in part telling the truth that way of Hartford, Connecticut has all of the same problems. They just might be less visible so you don't have to admit it, and telling the truth that way. But I also think I feel a responsibility to tell the truth internally, where I did it in the book in one scene. It was not in Mississippi, but it was an engineer in southeastern Missouri, which is basically the same landscape as the Mississippi Delta. And he was like, oh, we were driving around and had been having a lot of spats about politics. And at one point he was like, if urban America and rural America split apart, would urban America be able to survive without us? And I was like, no, definitely not. And then he's like, yeah, but could rural America survive without us? I was like, without urban America? And I was like, no, definitely not. And he's like, yeah, they could, right? And I was like, I'm going to have to pause and tell you why I disagree with that. And so it's just, it's like, as someone, I think I've gained a lot by being able to move back and forth between those worlds. And I see my responsibility as making sure that no one is able to pat themselves on the back about things either way.
Thank y'all. I want to ask another kind of big picture question. You write a book and you want reviews. People write about your book and they tell readers what your book is about. And you lose control at that point, right? When other people start reviewing your book, they tell the readers of whatever magazine or newspaper they write for, they tell people what your book is about. And I wondered, what do you, when you wrote your book, what were you trying to accomplish? At your most aspirational, in your heart of hearts, what did you intend your book to do? How did you, not even how it's received, but what do you want to change, or how did you want to affect people when you started out on this project?
Well, I started out on this project to make a book about people and the diversity of the South. And I think and hope that's what I've done. And then you move the book into the world, and as John T. says, you sort of lose control, and you start hearing back the narrative that people take from your book. And so what I find myself pushing back against is Kate has this book about gas stations. Or Kate has this book about food.
Right.
And I think all of us have found a lens that we put to work to discover the South. And for me, that has been this landscape of gas stations, because they're everywhere. They're in every town. Everyone passes through them. They are this little d democratic space that we all pass through on an almost daily basis. And so that for me was my way of documenting the, entire South per se. And so that's sort of what I have confronted and I'm trying to push beyond in those conversations.
So, Glitter Road is my 4th collection. So I wanted to do something for me creatively that was different. And the whole Grisham experience, me moving away from my home state for an academic year into an unfamiliar landscape, just on all levels, was completely different. And I wanted the work to reflect where I was right now. And the book covers a lot of topics like, the divorce and the loss of my ex-husband. It also documents where my family is, and there is the examining of the legacy of slavery and the Emmett Till narrative. And that's a lot. I remember first sitting down and talking with the then department chair at Old Miss, and reminding me of like the legacy of the writers who have come through. And so nothing was more terrifying than that. I at least just want to get something done. But by the end, I want people ultimately to enjoy reading a poem. I mean, it's very simple because not everybody, but many people have apprehension to reading a poem. You'll find one when you need it. So if it's a big moment like a wedding or a funeral, there's a poem for you. But I write about the small moments, like talking to your child or taking the dog for a walk or, having an uncomfortable conversation. And so some of those experiences are reflected in this book. And I talk about the extraordinary in the ordinary. It's the everyday. So I think ultimately, Natasha Trethewey was talking about this earlier, she wants her work to be clear. She wants people to get it. And being a Black writer, I don't feel like I have a lot of wiggle room with that. I want to be clear. I make no mistake because I feel like I'm, I think like all of us, we're documenting history, right? Yeah. We are telling our stories. And so we all know if we don't do that, then these stories don't get told, they disappear, or they are banned and they are censored. So I think it's important to, for me as a writer, to be honest and clear, and to even, make my poetry as approachable and, let that language lift off the page for the reader so that they can see themselves, some aspect reflected in the work.
And I'll say, I think for me, I sort of lost control of the book before I even wrote it. This is not the book I intended to write as my first book, sort of. And I will briefly explain. So January read about how I found the river. I had been living in the Delta for 6 years, loved life there, and then went on this canoe trip and was like, wait, what's out here? Like, I didn't know what the Mississippi River looked like. And it sounds like a lot of you may not too, right? I didn't see a lot of hands raised with about the canoe trips. It is as beautiful a landscape as exists anywhere in this country. And I didn't know that. And that just fascinated me. And so I started writing these sort of literary essays about life on the Batcher, the land between the levees. And that's what I wanted. I just wanted to understand this wilderness that I found that I couldn't believe still existed. And then I had a journalism fellowship at Berkeley that was run by Michael Pollan, and we got to have these chats with him. And he's like, "You're not going to make any money on that book." So he's like, if you want to do this, you have to tackle the Mississippi River as the whole thing. And I did not want to do that back then. And I don't know what changed was ambition. I was like, okay, I do want to have a career in this and got to make it work. But also, then I canoed from St. Louis all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and was reading all these other histories. And I was like, oh, I am very lucky to be living in the Delta, a place that's literally built from the rest of the continent, right? The soils there were carried there, and a place that so much of American history has traveled through. And so I was able to wrap my head around, there isn't quite a book like this out there that tries to tell the story of the river socially, ecologically for a popular audience. And there's a lot of issues that thread through that I care about. So I will do that and take it on.
Thank you all. I want to ask a question that's kind of a processy question. I I want to ask y'all to think about your field work, the prep work you do. And that may sound to some of the audience like an odd question to ask of someone who's on this panel who's a poet. But I think in various ways, each one of these people does their own kind of field work. They wander, they look, they observe, they ask questions. And I'd like y'all to talk about that, and however you choose to talk about it, but help us understand how you move through the world and accumulate the knowledge that it takes to do the thing you do.
With Glitter Road, the circumstances of coming down here, and then what was going on with that picture that went viral for oldness with the marker. I mean, that was sort of a pivotal event for me, and I think it was in October, so I come down in August. In October of 2019, they rededicated the memorial, so I went on that ride with my daughter, and there is something about being in the area, being in that moment with everybody there who really wanted to honor Emmett Till and to recognize the legacy, but to walk there and do for me, that's field work, and speaking to people there and continuing on and going to, many of the sites related to the Emmett Till story and doing research at Ole Miss. I mean, that was a huge part. I mean, poetry is documentation, much like the other genres, so there's really not too much that's different about that, but it's pivotal. And I also think too, when you can be in the location where these events happen, I think you gain something that's intangible. I mean, it's different than, reading a book and, and then getting the information and then trying to reimagine it for an audience. I mean, the experience of being on the Mississippi River, that was life-changing, So I could have watched a video and, gotten a perspective, but there's nothing like being there. And so I imagine also like going to these gas stations and you have to take pictures and speak with people. That's integral to what we do, I think.
January, would you extend that for a moment, that idea of poetry being documentary work?
Yeah.
'Cause I think that's really interesting to talk about.
Sure. I mean, it's just, I think it's really the same, but it's just the format is different. The genre is different. But, archival work, I think is essential. I mean, and it's how the poet reimagines, makes it essential for themselves. I mean, for me, a lot of it's driven by what I don't know. So I'm drawn to like experiences and gaining more of a perspective. And so I can't write about all experiences, and all experiences of Emmett Till's story. Some of it is just not poetic. But I was there at the rededication with my daughter, and that was poignant. She was 14, which was about the age of Emmett Till. So there were a lot of connections, and I think for me as a poet, staying open and looking for those connections kind of allows me to imagine, but it also says, well, part of this needs to be grounded, in research. So finding out the dates and going to the courthouse where the trial happened. I mean, a lot of that is essential. And it's a lost opportunity, as a poet, not to do that. I mean, my work is so much broader because I've been lucky enough to have this experience.
Thank you. Would y'all care to speak to field work?
Yeah. It's an interesting, I don't know that I have a defined process. I am very much an introvert, and I think my first stab at being a journalist in my early 20s before moving to Mississippi failed because I hated calling people on the phone. I think my process now, interestingly, I spend a lot of time in books, and my work is now much more rooted in history than I think that first effort. And so I spend a lot of time reading books and like thinking on this big grand scale. But then I think now, once I have that, then I go out in the field and I'm just like burning with questions, and the introversion doesn't matter because now I need to understand better, and I get out and I just don't care. I have to ask people things. But I think similar to January, in my own way, I never get anything until it's like I can like read about a landscape and I just cannot picture it until I'm there. So that's just getting out and spending time, and often just like inordinate hours just driving back roads along the Mississippi River, trying to get as close to it as I could. Wouldn't even need to be talking to anyone, just again, seeing it and thinking through all these things I read. And then sometimes for me, just being in motion on the road is when I get my best thinking done. So it's just a huge part of my practice is just to throw myself out there.
So if you're driving the river, conceptually you have your hand on the steering wheel.
Yes.
How do you recall all this? How do you make sense of what you take in?
Sometimes I travel. I mean, like I have a digital recorder, so that if I do happen to interview someone, I have that there. And sometimes on these trips, I will pull that out and start talking to it.
And narrate the landscape.
Narrate the landscape, or if it's just like a sentence that I'm like, oh, this is like a concept. I start. I before I got my MFA in fiction writing, so language matters a lot to me. It came into journalism in a weird way, and so sometimes it's like, oh no, that I have half of a paragraph, and I just need to get that down live now.
So in my work as a photojournalist, I travel around the South, and often that takes me to small towns and communities that are not my own. And so, when at lunchtime, I'm trying to figure out, am I going to go to, if there's a Burger King or a Subway or a gas station grill? And we all know when we walk into a Subway, before we walk in, we know what it smells like. And we know what's on the menu, and we know what it will taste like. It really tells us very little about where in this world we are. And so it just became part of my practice to go to the gas station grill instead, and to see, who's behind the cash register and what's on the menu, and what's the conversation topic for lunch that day, and what are the values? All of these things are sort of clues to tell me, where am I in the world? What is important to these people? Who lives here? What do they do for work? And so it just became my way of exploring, continuing to explore the South. In regards to process, I've been working on this book of photography for about 10 years. And in the beginning, all of the places that I stopped were really just, I'm on my way to somewhere else, and slam on the brakes because something looks interesting, whether that's a hand-painted sign or boiled peanuts or whatever it is. And then as I continued doing this, people would send me recommendations. I love your recommendations. Please keep them coming. But there are people who travel the world, and they have studied Yelp, and they have mapped out every meal before they get on the plane. And then there are people who fly by the seat of their pants and do no research. And it's important to me to do sort of a mix of both of those. Like, your recommendations are great, and so I would sort of plot my journey to some extent around those. And then try to leave plenty of space for my own self-discovery, to sort of follow my nose, and curate my own sense of what was important to the book. That said, it was sort of central in my mind, and continues to be, that this, I am a white middle-aged woman, and so I stopped at some 100 to 200 places for this book. And I chose those places based on my own criteria. And in many ways, the book feels unfinished, but you could work on it forever. But if anyone else was setting out to make this same book, they would make it differently. They would make different decisions about what's important and where to stop, and who to include and who to talk to. How will I be received when I go into this place? So there are all these decisions in play that led to the creation of this book. That I think we could all make this book differently. I don't know if that answers the question.
It did, and I'm curious. You used the word unfinished to talk about this book, and I wonder, what's your relationship, Kate, to this book you made and your ongoing life? Like, you drove away from the convenience store. Do you loop back?
I do. There came a point long after my book deadline that I was still sending my editor more content, and he was, please stop. Like, we've passed the print. The book is at the printer. And so I did stop sending those to him, but I have not stopping. It's really, it's the work was for me before it was for the book. And right. It continues to be interesting to me. People continue to be interesting to me. I continue to be curious about this place that we call the South, it's a dynamic place that's changing as I go out into the world each week. And so I want to continue to discover it.
Yeah, that dynamism is what draws us all, I
Yeah.
think, in a bunch of different ways. I'm curious about, this isn't a question I prepped y'all for, sorry. I'm curious about listening to y'all. Like, every book, every project is in conversation with things that came before it, and you know what's, in some degrees, what's going to come after. Like, there's an ongoing conversation, much like the one we're having now. And I wondered, as y'all were working on these specific projects, if there are particular authors to whom you turned or turned away from, directors, musicians, were there people with whom you were in communion? Were there people you were actively pushing back against? Like, give me a sense of that.
I'll answer and keep thinking. Maybe we can circle back. I mean, there are some seminal texts on the Mississippi River. John Barry's Rising Tide, John McPhee, a great essay called Atchafalaya. So one of the hard things for me was, again, those were topics that I knew I had to deal with that had been dealt with masterfully by others. And McPhee in particular, I learned to write nonfiction by reading John McPhee's writing about writing nonfiction. And so then to be like, well, I have to deal with the exact same thing he wrote about was very intimidating. I didn't really have a good answer except for to plug ahead and do it. I mean, in the section where I revisit the same territory as Rising Tide, Rising Tide details this dispute between two engineers, and when basically one of them commits to an engineering practice out of spite. And I quoted Rising Tide in the, saying sometimes you can't improve on like masterpieces, and that was sort of a wink to maybe John Barry caught it of like, I would hope to say something more about this, but I can't. You already said it all. And so that was my biggest thing. I don't know. I'll have to think more about pushing against or things, but it's like sort of how do I build on top of people who have been in this territory that have done so well.
I did a little of both. Marilyn Nelson wrote a sonnet series about Emmett Till, and I purposely, even though I have the book, I didn't like pull it off the shelf and read it because I didn't want to be too influenced. The other side of that is, I was reading a lot of Natasha Trethewey. When I came down in 2019, I just absorbed. I didn't do much writing. I took notes. So when I would go out or I'd visit a place or take pictures, but I wasn't writing poetry then. I was just sort of really trying to get the kids settled in their high school and figure out like my class schedule. And then COVID hit, March of 2020-ish. That's about when everything shut down. So we were here for another 2 months. And the Grisham house is a little isolated from the rest of the city. So we were sort of isolated anyway. But that was a good time to start doing the writing and the research. So I was listening. Actually, I was listening to whatever I can't remember, the New Orleans station that broadcast for Jazz Fest.
WWOZ.
Yeah, I was listening to a lot of that because I was missing New Orleans and missing Jazz Fest, which I've been to a few times. So that actually, I don't know, that got me through. That really, I don't know how helpful that is, but it was just sort of like a soundtrack in the background. I don't know why, but it was.
Don't have to know.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah.
On the photography side of things, growing up here in Mississippi, it's a land so rich in storytellers. Before I knew what that meant, and I think I'm still figuring out what that means, I was just surrounded by these influencers of great Southern narrative. And much of that was writing, but also photography. I see Maud Schuyler Clay in the audience in Langdon, Bernie Imes up in Columbus, certainly Eudora Welty here in Jackson, who of course was a photographer for years before she was a writer. More contemporary times, Boyce's good friend Rory Doyle up in the Mississippi Delta. And then now I live in North Carolina, and among many others, down the road is Bill Ferris, who was very helpful as I made this book, as well as Tom Rankin. So these just great documentarians who have invested their lives and their work in telling stories about this place, I think long impacted the way that I learned. I was sort of self-taught to approach narrative before I made any photographs myself. And then certainly traveling around the South and making this book, I would try to find storytellers about place where I was. I'm thinking most specifically of being in like the panhandle of Florida and being deep in Harry Cruise, which was like a super intense feeling, but
No
yeah,
joke.
trying to pluck writers along the way that would teach me, sort of ground me in context for this sub-region of the South where I happened to be. And then, that was one layer, and then I would find these gas stations to document, and those became sort of the other layers that would build on that.
I'm going to jump back to the process question, because part of my process is reading, like if I'm going somewhere, like let me find great literature from that place and like see this. Some other people might want to avoid that and not be influenced by it, but I was like, I want to see it through the eyes of geniuses that came before. I want to put on the music that fits that place. What I did push against, I think, in this book was formally, I said I canoed 1,000 miles on the river, and you might think that must be the narrative through line, but there are a lot of really good travelogues of the Mississippi, but I don't think they do what I wanted to accomplish, in that you get kind of solipsistic when you're writing a sort of travel memoir down the river. And it was important to me to talk about social problems on the river, ecological problems, and so I had to. There was a brief moment. I was like, maybe I'll also do my trip, and I'm here as a narrator to like show people this is what it looks like. But I realized that you could not accomplish what I was hoping to accomplish by doing yet another Mississippi travelogue.
Thank you all. There was a moment when Boyce was speaking a minute ago. He talked about being burning with questions. That was inspired by his travel, I think, when you were traveling with Rusky down the river, burning with questions. And that should be the state of your minds, burning with questions. And we love to hear them. I'll try to restate them. And we have 10 minutes. So it's a short amount of time for a lot of smart questions, which are coming forth now. No pressure. Yes, please.
What's the farthest up the river that you went? You said you did a canoe trip from St. Louis to New Orleans, but how far up?
Well, you can restate it.
So the question was, how far up the river did I go? So I visited the headwaters, and I canoed in Minnesota. I just haven't canoed the whole thing. But it's important to me of like, I don't think there is one headwaters to the Mississippi. I think the river we have here is so powerful because it comes from New York and from Saskatchewan and from Montana. So couldn't get to all the headwaters, and so it appears in the book, but that's the real river, the one right here.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Since you all kind of had your own like experience and preconceived notions of what Mississippi was, you being from Mississippi and y'all not being from Mississippi, when you finally experienced it, you wrote the book, you hear the reviews and what people say, when you're coming up with your next project, do you like, is this retaliation? How can I get them back? You know, they saying like, did they drink the tea? Drink the tea.
Right.
Because when they got here, do you feel like you always kind of have to still take up for your decisions on making Mississippi the focal point?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'll try to repeat that because I think everybody should speak to that. So, and forgive me if I really mess up your question. But she's asking, I believe, that now that you've written these books that center Mississippi and you've had to defend Mississippi, do you want to return to that? Is that something is that a conversation you want to keep going?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
That's perfect.
Okay. All right.
I think I'll spend most of my career working on understanding the South in different ways. I hear so often people using the South as shorthand for uneducated, illiterate, economically depressed, fill in your adjective there. And I feel like so much, people often conflate ideas about the South based on what our politicians or leaders are saying about the South, which so rarely, I think, represents the diversity of this place. And so, I think I'll dedicate most of my career to pushing back against that and complicating that, mixing that up, and trying to create greater understanding around that.
You know, as I think about what my next project might be, I'm not sure. I think about the poems that didn't get written for this book. You know, I wanted to write more about Mamie Till, Emmett Till's mother, and I didn't do that, and I feel like that's the one voice that's missing. So I'm not sure how much I want to dive back into that. And being here is a part of it. But again, I'm from Virginia originally, and I'm like, I've never really written about Virginia. And I was there for 23 years before I moved, so I feel like I need to examine that. And I also know, being in north of Boston, you know, we had a slave population there, and the city I'm in is doing a large-scale project around that with educating the public, getting it to the school system. And they've asked me to do some writing around that. So I think I'm trying to figure out that intersection from all the places that I've lived. I don't think I will. I think Mississippi will always be a part of me. My boyfriend lives here, so I feel like an honorary Mississippian when I come down.
Who's also in the front row.
Yeah. So we are pre-engaged, which is closer than it's closer than pre-engaged. So and part of it too, I think, is about exploration and my complications and obsessions and what is going to drive me. And sometimes that's in the moment, and sometimes that's a wider picture. So I think I'm still kind of looking for that through line. And so, I mean, that's kind of my answer, but it's not really an answer. So, yeah.
And I'll say in my case, like a yes and no, sort of interesting. Like I hesitate to share this because it could all fizzle. I'm talking to my agent about my next book, and my concept now is like the past and future of meat eating. And I think it will be deeply informed by living in the South. I will talk about Gulf Coast seafood as, you know, the importance of wild caught meat, and I will talk about the horrors of the chicken industry in Arkansas, but it's not at all a book about the South. But the flip side of that, this is a little bit of a shameless plug, but I'm working on plans of launching a print magazine about nature and outdoors in the South, and I think that is in some ways the reaction. Like, this book is nominally not a Southern book, it's about the whole watershed, but writing it made me realize, I think, that we have such beautiful nature down here, we have such a deep relationship with nature, but the American concept of nature kind of is all out west. And so I feel like I'm like actively embracing this project, and inspired in part by like True South and by the SFA, the Southern Foodways Alliance that John T has worked for. Of, you know, I think we as a region need to seize that and explore it together, and so that the country can understand and put the places in the South in their appropriate place in the national discourse about nature. So,
Thank you all. We have time for one more. Okay. Oh. No, it's okay. It's okay. He's a boyfriend. He can ask her the question later. No, you go.
He asks questions all the time.
She definitely doesn't want him to go, so you go.
No pressure.
no pressure.
Go on.
Things are heating up.
In poetry, it seems, and I'm not nearly smart enough to understand to the degree that you do, so that's what I mean. So in poetry, it seems to me like you have to find this a cadence, and you have to find phrasing, but then singular words that hook.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how that's how I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate at all with you in your process? And if so, do they move around simultaneously, or do you nail one of them down and then come back?
You know, I often start with image, but sometimes I start with sound. So I usually, you know, there's a moment, there is something that, trigger is not the right word, but there is something that I'm fascinated by, interested in. It might be something that I carry around. It could be a line, could be a misheard phrase. And then the craft is sort of building on that. Mm-hmm. And once I've written a draft, I will read it again and hear the flaws and look at the lines that are just not interesting or bridges to other connections, and really try to play with, I like to use the word complications with poetry. Like, I don't think, reading poetry shouldn't be a barrier to doing it. I don't think poetry has to be a puzzle. For me as a writer, I need to connect to the subject matter. And so I feel like if I can connect to it, then maybe almost anybody can connect to it. So it really should be approachable and something that might start a conversation. So does that sort of answer? Like, does it move all around? I don't know, you know? Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about it later, for sure, for sure.
We had another question in the back. I thought somebody was. Maybe they weren't. Then you. Yes, ma'am.
Is there out there a book, Poetry for Dummies?
Is
Or is there a book, because I am intimidated by it. I need
Yeah,
to
Right.
hear it and see it, and then I go, I still don't think, I need somebody to tell me
You know,
what I missed.
I was on Thursday. I was at an award ceremony in New England for a prize I didn't win, but the winner was an author named James Cruz, and he has these wonderful small anthologies. And now I'm going to blank on the name.
It's the art of
but she's gonna find it.
Yes, hold on. I'm going to find it quickly. But these books are, they really center on joy, gratitude. They are not complicated. He's got a.
But
can I
you're asking for a
find it?
manual on how to read
Right.
poetry.
This is.
Introductory book,
Right.
this is how, I know I need to go take
Right.
a course.
Right.
No, you don't. But no.
This
you
might
don't-
be,
no.
you might be coming up with something different. There's a series of books called The Art of Blank, and there's
Yeah.
fiction and fiction and poetry, and there's I think there's an Art of Syntax, James Longenbach,
Ooh, I
a
don't
great
know
book,
those,
Art
yeah.
of the Line Break. And so they're very slim books, and they're just like smart poets reading other poets, talking about how it works. Might be a good place to start.
I don't know that one. The Wonder of Small Things, The Path to Kindness, How to Love the World. I like those because they're approachable. They're the kind that you can share with somebody. They're really not longer than a page, and there are prompts in case you want to write. So they're not meant to be difficult. Really, I mean, poetry doesn't sell very much, but these books do. And I think they're wonderful gifts, and I will, shameless plug, I'm in all three. So. But it's a wonderful series of poetry. When I think, things won't sell or people don't get it, people really like those books by James Cruz.
I met a guy at a writer's residency in Arkansas, and he teaches at Tulane, and he wrote this book. And if you write me an email, johntedge@mac.com, when I get back to my bookshelf in Oxford, I'll send you the name of it. But it's exactly that. It is a kind of a how to read poetry and how to make it a part of your life. So I'm sorry I can't pull it out of the cerebellum.
Yeah.
We're done. She's telling me this is the universal symbol. Thank y'all so much.